James stood in the heart of the city, the sounds of the bustling crowd surrounding him as he adjusted his tie, a gesture that was second nature to him. His sharp blue suit, a symbol of his inherited wealth, gleamed under the early afternoon sun. He strode confidently, his head high, his eyes scanning the crowd with the kind of dismissive indifference that came from years of privilege. People hurried around him, each with their own concerns, but to James, they were little more than background noise in the grand narrative of his life. As he walked down the street, past the designer shops and luxury cars parked along the curb, a voice broke through the hum of the crowd. It was soft, almost fragile, but it caught his attention nonetheless. "Please, sir, could you spare some change?" James's eyes flickered to the source of the voice, a woman sitting against the cold, gray wall of a building. She was bundled in a ragged blanket, her face weathered by time and hardship. Her hands, outstretched in a gesture of desperation, trembled slightly. She had the worn appearance of someone who had been on the streets for far too long. For a brief moment, James hesitated, but only for a second. His expression twisted into something between annoyance and indifference as he glanced down at her. The city was full of people like her, he thought. People who chose to live in their own filth, too proud to work for their own survival. There was nothing special about her, nothing to suggest she was different from any other beggar he had passed by over the years. Without breaking his stride, he waved her off dismissively. "Get a job," he said, his voice cold and firm, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. The woman didn't respond, merely lowering her eyes. But James didn't notice. He was already moving on, his attention once again focused on his own path. As he continued walking, he felt a strange tension in his chest, an unease that he couldn't shake. He tried to ignore it, telling himself it was just the weight of the busy day ahead. But the moment lingered in his mind, and he found his thoughts drifting back to that woman, sitting on the cold sidewalk, asking for something he had no intention of giving. James's life was a series of carefully constructed moments, public events, private meetings, and social gatherings where appearances were everything. He had grown up in a world where wealth was not just a privilege, it was a responsibility, a mantle he was expected to bear with pride. His family's legacy was one of business success and social influence, and James, as the only heir, had been groomed from a young age to take over. His father, a stern and calculating businessman, had taught him the rules of the game, how to make deals, how to manipulate the market, and how to ensure that no matter what, the family's wealth would never diminish. James had learned the lessons well. He could charm investors with ease, strike deals with a smile, and make people believe he was one of the most capable men in the room. Yet, behind the polished exterior, James often felt hollow. He had everything anyone could ever want: money, power, status, but none of it brought him the satisfaction he had hoped for. He had always distanced himself from the reality of those who lived outside his world. The people who worked for him were simply that, workers. The homeless were invisible, part of the landscape that didn't deserve his attention. After all, he had earned his place in life. Why should he care about those who hadn't? Yet, there were moments when the weight of his own emptiness crept up on him. His relationships were shallow, built on convenience rather than genuine connection. He couldn't remember the last time he had truly enjoyed someone's company without the ever-present shadow of his family's expectations looming over him. He returned to his penthouse that evening, greeted by the silence that had become all too familiar. His apartment, sleek and modern, was filled with luxury. The marble countertops, the grand view of the city skyline, everything about it screamed success. And yet, as he walked through the empty rooms, he couldn't shake the feeling that it was all a facade. The wealth, the power, the influence, it all seemed so meaningless in that moment. James sat down on the edge of his sofa, the weight of his thoughts pressing down on him. He reached for his phone, but the screen stayed blank for a moment before he swiped it on. He scrolled mindlessly through his contacts, seeing names of business associates, family members, people who had always been there when he needed something. But there was no one he felt he could truly talk to, no one who could understand the loneliness that seemed to grow with every passing day. Then, out of nowhere, an alert popped up on his phone. It was a message from his assistant, a reminder of an important family event taking place the following evening. Another dinner with people who expected him to be perfect, to put on a mask and play his part. James groaned and dropped the phone onto the table. The same routine, day in and day out. As he sat there in the quiet of his penthouse, his thoughts drifted back to Sarah, the woman on the street. He couldn't understand why her face had stayed with him all day, why her image lingered in his mind like an unwelcome guest. He had treated her like any other homeless person, dismissing her without a second thought. And yet, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that he had missed something important. That night, as James lay in bed, the strange unease that had been building inside him all day intensified. The woman's face seemed to be everywhere, her tired eyes, her quiet plea for help. It was as though she had left an imprint on his mind that he couldn't erase. It was an unsettling feeling, but it didn't make sense. He had done nothing wrong, right? He had merely done what anyone in his position would have done, walked past the beggar and continued with his day. But now, he couldn't stop thinking about her. The following day was just like any other. James attended meetings, made phone calls, and performed his role as heir to the family fortune. But in the back of his mind, the woman's image lingered like a shadow, growing larger with each passing moment. He tried to push it away, but it refused to leave him. It was during one of these moments, sitting at his desk in his office, that the call came. The number was unfamiliar, but James answered anyway. "Mr. Johnson," the voice on the other end said. "You don't know me, but I have some important information about a woman you recently encountered." James felt a chill run down his spine. The voice seemed strangely familiar, but he couldn't place it. "Who is this?" James asked, his voice guarded. "It's about Sarah," the voice said. "The woman you saw yesterday. She's not who you think she is." James's breath caught in his throat. How could this person know about the woman on the street? What did they know about her that he didn't? James sat up straighter, his fingers gripping the edge of his desk. "What do you mean, not who I think she is?" The voice on the other end paused for a moment before responding, the tone now tinged with a note of seriousness. "Sarah isn't just some homeless woman. She's connected to your family. She's been watching you for a reason." The words hit James like a sudden jolt, and for a moment, he wasn't sure he had heard correctly. He stood, his mind racing. "What are you talking about? Who is she?" The voice continued, "Sarah is someone who once had everything. Her family was well known in the philanthropic world, and she was set to inherit a fortune, much like you. But a series of unfortunate events led to her downfall. She chose to live among the homeless to see if you, or anyone from your family, would notice. If you would understand what it means to care for those who have nothing left." James stood in stunned silence, unable to speak. The world he thought he knew had suddenly tilted, and he couldn't quite grasp what was happening. This couldn't be true. Sarah, the woman he had dismissed with a wave of his hand, the beggar he had walked past, how could she possibly be connected to his family? Why didn't she just tell me?" James finally managed to ask. "Because she wanted you to see her for who she truly is," the voice replied. "She didn't want pity. She wanted to see if you would have the heart to help someone, regardless of their status. She wanted you to understand what it means to truly care, not because of the wealth or the status, but because it's the right thing to do." James hung up the phone and stood motionless, his heart pounding in his chest. The brief conversation had shattered everything he thought he knew. All at once, his arrogance and the pride that had once seemed so essential felt like chains, holding him back from seeing the world with clear eyes. He had dismissed Sarah, not as a person, but as an obstacle, someone beneath him. But now, he realized, she was a mirror reflecting his deepest flaws. The rest of the day passed in a blur. James tried to focus on the meeting in front of him, but his thoughts kept drifting back to Sarah. What if she really was who the mysterious caller said she was? What if she had been watching him all along, waiting for a moment of reckoning? The unease that had lingered since the first time he met her only deepened, settling in his chest like a heavy weight. As the workday drew to a close, James found himself standing outside his office building, the evening city lights twinkling like stars above him. He wasn't sure what he was doing or where he was going, but something inside of him urged him to find Sarah. He walked briskly down the sidewalk, the cold air biting at his face as his mind raced. He thought he had everything figured out: wealth, power, control. But now, it felt like all of it was slipping through his fingers, like sand in the wind. He had spent so much of his life focused on accumulating more, always reaching for the next thing, but he had never stopped to question why he was doing it. And then there was Sarah. He reached the familiar street corner, the one where he had seen her just the day before. The place looked different now, as if the world around him had shifted and he was seeing it through new eyes. There, sitting against the wall, was Sarah. She hadn't moved, and yet she seemed different, more than just the homeless woman she appeared to be. There was a calm about her, a presence that drew him in, even from a distance. His heart beat faster as he approached. He didn't know what to say, didn't know how to fix the mess he had made. He had always been confident, always sure of himself, but standing in front of Sarah now, he felt lost. As he stopped in front of her, she looked up at him, her eyes meeting his without hesitation. For a moment, neither of them spoke. It was as if the weight of the world hung between them, a heavy silence that spoke louder than words ever could. Finally, James opened his mouth, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry," he said. I didn't know." Sarah didn't react right away. She just looked at him, her expression unreadable. James felt his throat tighten. He had thought he was in control of his own life, that he knew everything, but now, standing in front of Sarah, he realized how little he truly understood. "You're right," she said softly. "You didn't know. But you know now. And that's what matters." James knelt in front of her, the cool pavement pressing against his knees. He had never felt so humbled, so raw. The man who had once walked past her, dismissing her as if she were invisible, was now on his knees, realizing that everything he had believed about himself and the world was wrong. "I've been so blind," he said, his voice breaking with emotion. "I thought I was above it all. Above people like you. But I was wrong. So wrong." Sarah looked at him, her eyes steady but not unkind. "You have the power to change, James. The world isn't about what you can take from it, but what you can give. Don't let your wealth define who you are. Let your actions do that." James sat there, unable to speak for a long time. He didn't know what he had expected from this moment, but it wasn't this. It wasn't the quiet understanding that Sarah had shown him. He had come here expecting an apology, a way to fix everything, but now he realized it wasn't that simple. The silence between them stretched on, but in that silence, something shifted. James wasn't just asking for forgiveness, he was realizing the depth of his own mistakes. And as he sat there, he understood something that had always eluded him before: real power wasn't about wealth. It was about humility, kindness, and the ability to change. The next few days passed in a haze for James. He couldn't stop thinking about Sarah, about the conversation they had shared and the lessons she had imparted on him. He had started to change, slowly but surely. He began reaching out to those in need, using his resources to make a difference in ways he never had before. But it wasn't just about charity. It was about seeing people, really seeing them, and understanding that everyone had a story, a struggle, and a worth that wasn't defined by their social status. James couldn't undo the past. He couldn't take back the words he had spoken to Sarah, but he could start fresh. And that, for the first time in his life, made him feel like he was truly living. James's life continued to shift in ways he hadn't anticipated. With each passing day, he found himself making small but meaningful changes. His once luxurious routine was now filled with moments of self-reflection. He started to see the world in a new light. People weren't just obstacles or means to an end. They were human beings with struggles, dreams, and stories that deserved to be heard. The following week, he found himself walking down the same street again, where everything had begun. But this time, he wasn't just passing by. This time, he had a purpose. He walked slowly, his eyes scanning the sidewalks for Sarah. It was as if the city had changed along with him, The bustling streets, the towering buildings, the busy people, everything seemed quieter now. It was as though, for the first time, he was fully present in the moment. He spotted her near the same corner, her blanket wrapped tightly around her shoulders. She was sitting against the wall again, but this time, her posture was different. She wasn't as resigned as before. There was a quiet strength in the way she held herself, a resilience that spoke volumes without saying a word. James's heart pounded in his chest as he approached her. He wasn't sure what he was going to say, but he knew he had to speak to her. There was no turning back now. He had changed, and this was the moment where he could prove it. When Sarah saw him, her eyes flickered with recognition, but she didn't move. She simply waited, her gaze steady and patient. James stopped in front of her, his hands in his pockets, unsure of how to begin. I've been thinking about what you said, he started, his voice hesitant at first, but it gained strength as he continued. I've been thinking about how I treated you, and about how I've lived my life. And I realized I was wrong. Sarah didn't respond immediately, but there was a slight shift in her expression, something that resembled acknowledgement, but it was subtle. James took a deep breath, his words coming more freely now. You were right about everything, he said. I've spent my life focused on the wrong things, wealth, status, power, and I never once stopped to consider the real meaning behind all of it. I never understood what it meant to truly help, to care for others without expecting anything in return. Sarah's eyes softened, and for the first time, she spoke. It's not about expecting anything, she said quietly. It's about doing the right thing, even when no one is watching. When you're privileged, it's easy to forget that others are struggling, that not everyone has the same opportunities. But you're not defined by your wealth, James. You're defined by what you choose to do with it. James felt the weight of her words settle in his chest. He had lived so long thinking he was in control of his life, but now, with Sarah's simple yet powerful words, he realized how much he had taken for granted. It wasn't just about money or influence, it was about compassion, understanding, and using whatever power you had to lift others up. I want to make things right, James said, his voice firm with determination. I want to help you. I want to help people like you. I can't undo the past, but I can change the future. Sarah's eyes searched his face, studying him for a long moment. James felt a mix of vulnerability and hope, wondering if she believed him, wondering if he had truly earned her trust. After what felt like an eternity, Sarah nodded. It's a start, she said, her voice soft but steady. Just remember, it's not enough to give money. You need to give your time, your heart, and your understanding. That's what will make a difference. James swallowed hard, his emotions overwhelming him. He wasn't sure how he could make up for all the times he had failed to see the humanity in others, but he knew one thing for certain: he would start right here, right now. He would change, not just for himself, but for everyone he had overlooked in his quest for more. In the days that followed, James began to take action. He used his wealth and influence to support various charities and organizations that helped the homeless, the forgotten, the voiceless. But more importantly, he became involved in these efforts personally. He didn't just write checks or make empty promises, he volunteered his time, working alongside those who had once been invisible to him. It wasn't easy at first. There were moments of discomfort, moments when he felt out of place, but those moments were far outweighed by the small victories, the grateful smiles, the stories of struggle and survival, the realization that he could truly make a difference. With each interaction, his view of the world expanded, and he felt himself growing in ways he hadn't imagined possible. One afternoon, James found himself in a community center, helping to distribute food to families in need. As he handed a meal to an elderly woman, she looked up at him with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she said, her voice cracked with emotion. "You don't know how much this means to us." James smiled, feeling a warmth spread through him that he had never experienced before. "It's the least I can do," he said softly. "It's just the right thing to do." As he worked alongside Sarah, who had become a quiet mentor to him, James began to realize that his life had purpose beyond the boardrooms and fancy parties. It wasn't about wealth, it was about impact. It wasn't about control, it was about connection. And for the first time in a long while, James felt a sense of peace. The world that had once seemed so cold and distant now felt like a place where change was possible, where every action, no matter how small, could create ripples that would touch lives in ways he had never imagined. And through it all, he never forgot Sarah, her words, her presence, and the quiet strength that had challenged him to see beyond his own reflection. The weeks that followed were some of the most meaningful in James's life. Every day brought new lessons, new challenges, but with each step, he felt himself becoming more grounded, more connected to the world around him. The once sterile and empty walls of his penthouse now felt like a distant memory, replaced by the bustling streets and the faces of people who, just months ago, he would have ignored without a second thought. He continued to meet Sarah, not as a beggar on the street, but as someone who had been his guide through this journey of transformation. She had become more than just a reminder of his past mistakes. She had become a symbol of redemption, of what it truly meant to care about the world beyond one's own circle. And every time they met, she spoke less and less. She didn't need to say much anymore. Her silent wisdom was enough. One morning, James found himself in a community shelter, serving food alongside volunteers, some of whom had been in his position once. The staff was surprised to see him there, but no one questioned him. They saw the change in him, and that was all that mattered. As he served a meal to a young mother and her child, the warmth in his chest was overwhelming. The mother looked up at him with tears in her eyes, a silent thank you in her gaze. James smiled, but it was more than a simple gesture. It was an acknowledgement of how far he had come. The man who once only saw people for what they could do for him now saw them as equals, as fellow human beings who deserved his time, his attention, and his respect. Weeks turned into months. The work didn't stop, neither did the constant need to keep pushing forward. But James no longer felt overwhelmed by it. He had learned to pace himself, to find balance in giving without expectation. He didn't need accolades or recognition. What mattered most was the genuine impact he had on others' lives. He began to look at his wealth not as a tool for self-preservation, but as a way to build bridges and uplift those who had been left behind. One day, as he sat in a meeting with his father, a meeting he used to dread, always filled with critiques and expectations, he looked across the table and realized how much had changed. His father was still the same, calculating, pragmatic, always measuring success in terms of profit and loss. But for the first time, James didn't feel pressured to live up to that expectation. He had forged his own path, one that had nothing to do with the legacy his father had built and everything to do with the legacy he wanted to create. His father looked at him, perhaps sensing the shift, perhaps seeing the change in his son. There was a moment of silence before his father spoke, his voice gruff but not without a trace of pride. "You've been different lately," his father said, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Something's changed." James didn't hesitate. He had been waiting for this moment, the moment when he could speak the truth and no longer carry the weight of pretending. "I've realized that it's not about the numbers. It's not about the bottom line or making deals. It's about people. And I want to use what I have to help people, to make a real difference." His father stared at him, seemingly processing the words. For a moment, the room was still. James wasn't sure what to expect, whether his father would scoff at him, dismiss him as naive, or even worse, ignore his words completely. But then, after what seemed like an eternity, his father gave a slight nod. "I suppose there's more to life than just business," he muttered, almost begrudgingly. "But don't forget, your success is still your responsibility. Just remember, there's a balance." James felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. His father might not have fully understood his transformation, but he had accepted it. That was enough. And it was more than James could have hoped for. One evening, as the sun set over the city, casting a golden glow over the skyline, James walked through the park where he and Sarah had once met. It was quiet now, the city's noise muted by the distance and the soft rustling of the trees. He walked slowly, his hands in his pockets, as he reflected on how far he had come. He wasn't perfect. He still had a long way to go. But he had changed in ways he hadn't even thought possible. And then, as he reached the bench where he had first seen Sarah, he saw her once again, sitting there quietly, looking out at the city. She was the same, yet different. Her eyes, once filled with a quiet challenge, now held a look of peace. James approached her, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. There was no need. The silence between them was comfortable, a shared understanding that said everything they needed to say. He sat down beside her, his gaze following hers as they looked out over the city together. "You've come a long way," Sarah said after a while, her voice soft but full of meaning. "I'm proud of you." James looked at her, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "I couldn't have done it without you," he replied. "You showed me what I was missing." Sarah nodded, a quiet acknowledgement of the role she had played in his transformation. She hadn't forced him to change, she had simply given him the chance to see the world for what it truly was. "I didn't do anything," she said, her voice light. "You found the strength in yourself." James sat back, the weight of her words sinking in. She was right. The change had always been within him. She had just helped him see it. The world around them seemed quieter now, more peaceful. The city that had once felt overwhelming now felt full of possibility. James knew that his journey wasn't over, but for the first time, he felt like he was on the right path. He had learned the value of humility, of compassion, and of seeing others for who they truly were. As they sat together in the fading light, James realized that the greatest gift Sarah had given him wasn't just her wisdom, it was the chance to find meaning in a life he had once taken for granted. And as he looked at her, he understood that the real power wasn't in wealth or status, it was in the way we choose to treat others, the way we choose to live with compassion and empathy. And that was something James would carry with him for the rest of his life.